G'day everyone, this is Andrew Price from BlenderGuru.com coming at you today with a very exciting tutorial, something that I have been waiting to do for a very long time, and now the time is right. Today we're going to be talking all about cycles. Now cycles is that new feature of Blender which everybody's raving about, everybody's talking about it on the forums. There's a lot of questions, there's a lot of ifs and buts and all that other stuff, so I'm hoping to address the topic of cycles in its entirety in this tutorial. So you don't have to know anything about it. In order to get started, I'm going to walk you through, first of all, what it is, why you should be excited about it, and then we're going to get to a hands-on demonstration of how to use it and how to set it up and essentially get your first scene going. So first things first, let's talk about cycles. What is it? Okay, now to understand what cycles is, you first need to understand how 3D software works. Okay, so in Blender, you create a model, you light the scene, you hit F12, and then it renders it. Okay, now when it renders it, it applies a certain lighting and rendering algorithm, and it produces a finished final image that you can see right here. Now cycles is exactly the same. You're still creating things in Blender, you're still lighting it, but when you hit F12, it's using a different rendering and lighting algorithm that produces more accurate, more physically accurate, and more realistic looking results. Okay, now here's those two images again, but up close. This is the Blender internal render, okay? Now this is the cycles render, okay? Now as I flick back between the two, you'll notice two differences. Cycles is a lot more realistic, okay? Now, if you have a look at the Blender internal one, you'll notice that the entire left-hand side of the monkey's face is black. Now, the reason for that is that Blender uses direct point lighting, meaning that you have one lamp and it lights the object and that's it. So if you haven't got a lamp on the other side of the monkey's face, it's not going to receive any light at all. Now, of course, that's very unrealistic to the way the real world works. If you have one window in your bedroom and the light comes in through that bedroom, it lights the entire room by bouncing off the walls, bouncing off the ceiling, and all the other objects in it. Cycles does just that. It lights it, and it also calculates the bounce lighting. So you'll notice that the left-hand side of the monkey's face has light on it because it's bounced off the ground underneath it, and it's casting the light on it. So as you can see, you do get more realistic looking results using cycles. As another example, let's take this donut scene right here. If you were to render this using the Blender internal render engine, I'm sorry to say you might get a result like this. Now, I've seen these sort of results online before, and it's unfortunately, it's very common. If you're using the Blender internal render engine, chances are, if you're doing an up-close scene like this, you're gonna get some ugly looking results. Cycles, on the other hand, gives you a lot more realistic looking results. Oops, somebody's popped online. There you go. Now, the difference between these two, as you flip back and forth, is of course the lighting. Okay, now as I flick back, notice underneath the plates, underneath the donuts and things like that, you'll notice that they're completely dark compared with the cycles render. Okay, now again, that comes back to what I said about there being no bounce lighting using the Blender internal render engine. Okay, so cycles is all about that. It's more physically accurate to the way the real world works. So another cool thing is this is something I realized when I was creating this picture. I no longer had to go out there and look for certain lighting tutorials or techniques on how to render food and things like that. I actually went to YouTube and researched food photography because all I needed to know was how to light it in the real world, and then I could replicate that exact same lighting scheme in Blender just by using planes. So it's very cool. It's a lot easier to work with, and the results speak for themselves. It's just it's very awesome. Now, some of you probably have already seen this online. You've been out there, you've had a look at some amazing piece of artwork that somebody's created using 3ds Max, and you've thought, wow, those results look amazing. How come I can't get that with Blender? Well, chances are they're using an external rendering external renderer that has these features already, such as V-Ray, Octane, things like that. They've had these features for years. Blender's been stuck in the Stone Age by using the Blender internal render engine. So other softwares have been using these features for a very long time. It's kind of the standard. The industry standard is that the renderer, you know, is known as an unbiased rendering engine. That's the technical term. So that's probably why in 2010, when I interviewed you, surveyed you guys and asked you what aspect of Blender needs the most improvement, an alarming amount of you said the render engine. No big surprise right there. So you can all thank Brett Van Lommel. Brett Van Lommel is the guy who came up with the idea for Cycles, and he's essentially the one developer working on it. There's another guy, Thomas Dinges, who is helping him, but essentially it's all down to Brett and Thomas that have put all this together, and it's incredible to finally see it happening in Blender. It's very exciting, and to me, it is the biggest and best feature to happen to Blender since the undo function. But wait, there is more. So I've discussed the lighting and the shading and stuff like that, but we're really only at the tip of the iceberg of what Cycles is and the features that it has. So just to go over a few more, let's talk about the way things are rendered. If you use the Blender internal render engine, the entire weight and all the work as it's rendering is handled by the CPU. Cycles, on the other hand, uses the GPU, which is the graphics card of your machine. Now, the graphics card rendering is kind of like a new type feature in the 3D software industry. Everybody's very excited about it because it produces renders a lot faster than the CPU. Now, the CPU is still good for some things in that it does a very good job at certain lighting and shading things, but generally the industry is now turning to GPU rendering because it just does things a lot faster. Now, it depends on your machine, of course, as to what sort of results you're going to see. If you have an older graphics card, chances are your CPU is actually going to be faster than your graphics card. But in my case, my graphics card will actually render it half the speed of what the CPU did it in. So, sorry, half the time. Sorry, yeah. So it's very, very cool, and it's a very, very big feature, and I'm glad that Cycles has it. Another cool thing is that you get real-time feedback. Now, this is awesome. In Blender internal render engine, you always had to hit F12, see the results, then make some changes, hit F12 again, and there was a lot of waiting around, waiting for the stuff to render. Cycles does everything real-time. It's awesome to see it happen right in front of you. You can move around, move the camera, move objects, change the materials, do whatever you want, and you'll be able to see it in real time. It's excellent to be able to see this, and I'm just so glad that it is in Cycles. Another cool one is HDR lighting, something a lot of people have been wanting for a very long time. The ability to light a scene according to a photograph. So you get a photograph, an HDR photograph, and then you can use that to light the entire scene, and you don't need to add any lighting yourself. It's lit by the image. This is something that Blender didn't have. It kind of faked it, like cheated it a little bit, but Cycles does it properly, does a good job, and it's very, very cool. Alright, so now that I've given you a brief introduction to what Cycles is, what I'm going to do now is give you a hands-on demonstration of how to set up your very first scene using Cycles. We're going to get to the donut scene at the end, but I'm just going to do this bite-sized tutorial for people that want to get stuck straight into it. So the way to turn on Cycles is you go to the top bar, click that little drop-down box, and then you should see Cycles, so go ahead and click on that. Now, if you don't see Cycles in there, then what you need to do is go to File, User Preferences, Add-ons, and then type in Cycles, and you should see it right there. Just go ahead and check that box, and if you don't see it there, then you'll need to download a different version of Blender, which does have that there. Anyway, okay, so now you've got Cycles enabled. You will notice that in the render options here, a lot of things have changed. You'll notice that you'll see words like samples and light paths and all that other complicated stuff. That's all very advanced, and I'm sure you're going to learn about that as you use Cycles more, but it's not essential to know this stuff in order to get started, so don't let any of this stuff scare you. It's just there. The default settings usually work quite well, and I'm sure you'll pick up the rest as you go along. Now, in order to make it so that you can render everything that you see, you go down to the bottom bar here, and then in the viewport shading, you just set that to rendered. And now we can see a real rendered preview of the scene. Now, you probably won't be able to see much there at all. It's just like a grey, slightly grey cube. The reason for that is that the scene at the moment is very bland. You've just got a cube against a grey backdrop and the lighting doesn't work. So what I'm going to do is just create a very simple scene just so that we've got something to work with. Monkey. Got to add the Suzanne head, of course, or else it wouldn't be a test scene. So let's just do that. Okay, cool. Now, the way lighting works in Cycles is it doesn't actually use these lamps. Or it might in the future, like you might be able to use the sun lamp and stuff like that. But I've been advised against it because it's unnatural to the way real light works in the real world. Because these lights, if it's only going to be casting a light from its tiny little pinpoint right there. But in real life, obviously, lamps have a size to them. So, you know, the sun, for example, is a ball shape. So if you want to create a sun, you should really create a really, really small circle and then have that cast light. Anyway, I'm getting in ahead of myself there. So the way you light things in Cycles really is you use objects. So you can add any object you like, but I'm going to make this a plane, and this is going to be my lamp. Okay, now the way you make this a light is you go to the material options and then add a new material, and whoa, you will notice everything here has changed. You will not recognize any of these buttons right here, and that's of course because you've enabled Cycles now. All the materials have changed. Now that's pretty much the only thing in Cycles, in Blender that has changed. So I mean, everything else is pretty much consistent. You really only need to learn the materials and you've pretty much cracked Cycles. So don't let it scare you off. Basically in the drop down box here you've got a number of different presets for the material or different types of materials. The one we need is emission, so go ahead and check that. And if I go to the rendered viewport mode, you can see that our lamp here is casting light onto the monkey head. So I can go ahead and turn up the amount of emission, setting that to 20, and I can also change the color of that lamp as well, so you can do some fun stuff. Now you'll notice that it's rendering it quite slow at the moment. Like it's very, very grainy, and it's that's the other thing I suppose I should mention, is that it doesn't render it in kind of squares as Blender usually does. It renders it as a whole image first, like really, really noisy, and then it gets clearer and clearer as time goes on. And there's really no end point to when it has finished a render. You essentially have to tell Blender, yep, that's enough. It's clear enough, and that's it. So just be aware of that. Now, anyway, it's going quite slowly at the moment, like really slowly. So I'm going to go to the render options here, and then underneath device, you can see it's set to CPU. So if I click that, I can now change it to GPU. And what will happen is, it now renders a lot faster. Now this is going to vary depending on what machine you've got. I've got a graphics card, GTX 470 NVIDIA, if anybody's curious. So for some people, the CPU will be faster than the GPU. So just experiment with yourself. Maybe your graphics card doesn't even work with GPU. It needs to be CUDA enabled for most things. So anyway, just do some research on that and you'll figure it out. Anyway, so yeah, it's working fine and it looks fine and dandy. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to select that plane there. You can't actually see me selecting because there's no real selection around it. But I'm going to go ahead and duplicate it. I'm going to put one on that side right there. You can see how cool it is having everything displaying in real time as you move around. It's really, really quick, really easy to get things set up. So for this new plane, I'm just going to give it a new color, make it slightly blue. It's too blue, maybe something like that. And that one we'll leave as 20, maybe make it a bit smaller, maybe make it 30. And maybe 40. Anyway, you can experiment with this stuff in your own time. For the monkey, I'm just going to very quickly give it a new material. And for this one, I'm going to give it a glossy material. And essentially, that is a very reflective material, like 100% reflective. And you can change the roughness of it right there. So if I set that to 0, it's going to be very, very sharp looking reflections. And if I set that to something higher, it's going to be very, very soft looking reflections. I'm just going to leave it at the default value of 0.2 because that's fine. And I'm also just going to change the background color as well. So click on World, click on Use Nodes, and then just change the color of the background to whatever you want. I'm going to make it black. And there you go. So I'm going to snap the camera to my viewport, Control Alt Number Pad 0.
And I'm just going to position it right here. Let's move it up, a little bit down perhaps, like so. Now, one other thing I should note is that as you're moving around the viewport like this, it's going to essentially continuously render. So you can see at the top there you've got path tracing samples, and that number is increasing. Now, the higher that number gets, the clearer your render will look. So generally around about 1,000, 2,000 samples, you get a very clear looking render. So that should be what you want. Now that's going to continue going forever, because if you go to the render settings, underneath the samples for preview, you've got 0. Now 0 means it's unlimited. However, if you set this sample amount to say 10, then when you move the camera, it's going to render 10 samples and then it's going to stop. So that's just a really, if you don't want it to continuously use computing power as you're using Blender, you can do something like that just to, so the machine doesn't slow right down to a halt. Now for render, that's when you hit F12 and it renders. So if you did it right now, what would happen is you would get a very noisy looking scene like that. So I'm going to go ahead and turn this up to, 500. Let's say 500. Hit render again. And now it's going to essentially do the exact same thing. That image is going to get clearer and clearer and clearer until it gets to 500, and then it's going to stop. So let's just wait for that to happen. And there you go. So that is the finished render right there. So the way you save this is exactly like you would in Blender normally. Just hit F3, dump it somewhere on your hard drive. I might put it on my desktop just to show you. Monkey. And we'll go straight to my desktop. How do I do that? Let's minimize. And there you go. Got the monkey, and it's all good to go. So there you go, guys. If you want to get stuck into it, that is a brief introduction to using cycles for the very first time. Now moving on to the donut scene. Now in this tutorial, I'm not actually going to walk you through the entire creation process of this scene, because aside from the fact that it's really got nothing to do with cycles, it would be a very long and boring tutorial, as the scene took me several days to put together anyway. So all I'm going to do is show you setting up the materials and the lighting. So I'm going to show you, the semi-gloss materials, the textured floor, the lighting, the glass, highly reflective objects like the spoon, all that good stuff, and then you can use that in your future scenes that you create. However, since I know a lot of people are going to ask this in the comments, I thought I'd just show you briefly how you can create a donut. First, you add a torus. You then use the fluid simulator to drop another torus on top of that to create the icing. Then you model around about 6 sprinkles. You would give them different colors, and then use the particle system to distribute that over the top of the icing. Very, very simple, very easy, and there you go. You have your very own tasty donut. Now, moving on to the tutorial. Alright, so what we've got here is the finished scene as is, but without any materials added. So all the materials are blank, they're white materials, except for the sprinkles. We're not going to do them, that's too tedious. But yeah, everything else is blank, and it's ready to go. So what I'm going to do is show you how to set up the chocolate icing material, the wooden floor material, the glass bowl, a chrome spoon, simple things like that you can learn from and use to put in your own in scenes within cycles. And as well as that, I'm also going to show you the lighting scheme, so how to set up a very simple but effective lighting system in cycles. So yeah, that's the first thing I'm going to show you. Let's jump to layer 11 right now. Just this is kind of the bare box basics of the scene here, and I'm going to show you how to set up the lighting. So first thing I'm going to do is add in a plane, and I'm going to move this up here, rotate this by 90 degrees, and scale it up. Now what this is going to be is acting as a window, because this is supposed to be a real scene, okay? So this is supposed to look like a kitchen bench, and this is a window which is casting in some morning sunshine. That's the kind of scheme I want to go for, kind of like a warm, very welcoming kind of color scheme. So I'm just going to position this right here, and as I explained before, to turn this object into a lamp, you add a new material, and then in the drop down box you select emission. Now I'm just going to turn on rendered viewport shading just to show you what it's doing. I'm going to change the strength of it to become 30, so it's quite bright, but it'll give it a nice, really powerful kick from behind. And the color, I'm going to change it to be something of morning sunshine. Now this is debatable depending on who you ask what that would be, but I found a color like this works quite well. Now the next thing I want to do is add in a second light, and this is going to be the side light or the fill light or the kicker light, whatever you want to call it. So I'm just going to duplicate this plane right here, rotate it by 90 degrees like so. Now it's very important that when you duplicate a lamp like this, that you go to the material options and you check single user copy. Otherwise you're going to be changing the settings for both of those, as I'm sure you've probably done in the past. So I'm going to change the strength of this fill light to be 5, so it's a lot softer, a lot subtler. And the color, I'm going to make it to be a nice kind of reddish color, just for a little bit of variation and yeah, a little bit more warm type of atmosphere. And you might be thinking, what's next? Well, that's it for lighting. That's really all there is to it. As I explained, Cycles is really good. It does the rest for you. Once you've set up the scene with some lamps as they would be in the real world, it'll take care of the rest. And it's really, really good at that. Okay, now the next thing I'm going to do is show you possibly one of the most difficult materials, okay, or at least in this tutorial. That is the wooden floor, okay? So we're going to be adding an image texture. We're also going to be making that use bump mapping. We're also going to change the scaling of that. We're going to make it slightly reflective, so it's semi-glossy. So we're going to use a different amount of different shaders to create this effect. So with the plane there selected, add a new material. And from this drop down list here, I'll just tell you a couple of the most used shaders, okay? So you've got the diffuse, that is a basic white clay material, so it's not gonna have any reflectivity at all. And then you've got glossy, which is the exact opposite. It is 100% reflection, okay? So if I set this roughness down to 0, you've now got 100% mirror effect, okay? Now you can change the amount of roughness or the softness of that reflection by turning that up, but you'll notice that there's no way to turn down the reflectivity of that material. That's because you're supposed to use a different shader for that. The way you do this is by using a mix shader. A mix shader is essentially as it sounds. It allows you to mix 2 different shaders together to create one. So what we need to do is use a glossy shader combined with a diffuse shader, and this is going to allow us more control over how much reflectivity it gets as to how much normal color it would get. So it's very, very simple. You've got the factor amount at the top. If I turn this all the way up to 1, I'm going to get 100% of the diffuse shader, and if I turn it all the way down to 0, I'm going to get 100% of the glossy shader, like so. So I'm going to set this to actually be a 0.9, okay? So that's going to be a blend of mostly the diffuse shader and then 10% of the glossy shader, okay? So you don't want it to be too reflective, but just a little bit, okay? All right, I'm also going to turn up the roughness as well to about a 0.1, just to give it a little bit of a soft kind of look. Now, in order to add an image texture, traditionally in Blender what you do is go to the texture panel. That's not what you do in Cycles. You do that by going to the diffuse, color, and then at the end of the color there is a little dot. You click that and you get more options, one of them being image texture. So you click that and then you've got an open image button. So click that and select the texture that you want to load in. I'm going to use one off CG Textures. And there we go. The image is now loaded into Cycles. However, you'll notice that the plane is not showing that image at all. It's kind of tweaked it a little bit. It looks orange, but the image isn't there. Why is that happening? Well, the answer is that Cycles uses a different image mapping by default. Blender uses generated image mapping by default unless you change it. However, Cycles uses UV mapping by default unless you change it. So currently right now it is using the UV coordinates of the plane to map the image to it. However, the plane has not been UV unwrapped. So that's why the image is not displaying. So you have 2 choices. 1 is to UV unwrap the plane, and 2 is to change the coordinates to become generated. That's easier, so that's what we're going to do. So you do that by going to Vector in this drop-down box here, and then underneath Texture Coordinate, set that to Generated. And voila! We now have the image loaded into Cycles, and it is as simple as that. However, you will notice here that the scaling of it is a little bit off. It's rather huge. If we had a donut sitting here, the donut would look really, really, really tiny in regards to these huge looking wooden floorboards there. So what we want to do is turn up the scaling of this image to make it look smaller, obviously. Now, normally in Blender, you've got the scaling options right underneath the image texture. That isn't so in Cycles. The way you change it in Cycles is by actually going to the node editor. Now, if I'm confusing you at this point, don't worry, it'll all make sense very shortly. The materials in Cycles are all controlled by the nodes, okay? What we were doing over here was really a simplified kind of hybrid of using the node editor. It's like really like a beginner's way of adding materials and things like that. But you'll notice that over here in the node editor, it's actually done everything that we were doing in the interface before. So it's added in an image texture, applied generated coordinates to it, then fed it through a diffuse shader, combined it with a glossy shader together at 0.9, and then outputted it into this surface right here. And that now has become the material. So it's done all that for us just by us selecting those buttons there. So it's designed to really be, it can be controlled predominantly by these buttons over here. You don't have to get into the material nodes that often. However, if you want to do advanced things, then you will have to use the material nodes. So because we're going to have to change the scaling of our image texture here, we're going to use the node editor. However, I will say at this point, this is a good thing, not a hindrance, by having to use the node editor, okay? It's really, really flexible. The more you use nodes, the more you'll know what I'm talking about. Okay, so in order to change the scaling of our image, what we need to do is drop in a mapping node in between the image node and the texture coordinate node. So right in here, and you'll see that we now have scaling options right here. So I'm now going to change the scaling to be 2.5, 2.5, and 2.5. And you'll notice that as I do that, the image over here has now adjusted, and we now have proper scaling to what we need. So that's essentially it. Really, really easy, and yeah, it's quite flexible. So you can do a whole number of different stuff here. I was having a look on Blender Artist at some of the threads in there. Some people have done some crazy setups by adding a whole bunch of different shaders together. So you can do some really cool and creative stuff using the material nodes. So definitely check it out. It is worthwhile. Now, one thing we want to do next is to add in a bump map, okay? Now, when I was first using Cycles, I was looking for the, textures. Where do I add in a bump map? Where's bump? Where's the normal button or whatever that you normally use in Blender? It's actually right here. It's displacement. Now, you might get confused by that because traditionally in Blender, when you see the word displacement, it's talking about the displacement of the geometry of the object, not those fine little bump details that you see on a texture. But that's actually what it's called in Cycles. It's called displacements. That is what bump mapping is. Now, in order to get a displacement to work in Cycles, you don't click here, or you can, but you'll see that there isn't actually an image texture option here, or at least not yet. I don't know if they're going to put one there, but it doesn't matter anyway. The way we're going to do that is by using the material nodes again. So whatever you put into this value right over here where it says displacement, that is going to be the bump mapping for the object. So if I take the output from this image texture and put it straight in there in the displacement, like so, you'll notice that the floor now has bump mapping, but it is really, really extreme bump mapping. Like if I zoom right in there, you can see exactly how much bump mapping has been applied, and it is, to say the least, a little excessive. That's because it's applying 100% maximum bump mapping. So the way we turn this down is by adding in a mix node. Now this doesn't really make a lot of sense to me, but I'm sure somebody would explain it a little bit better and whatever. But the way you turn down the bump mapping is by adding in a multiply node like this. So first of all, mix node, then changing the blend type to be multiply. Then you take the output from the image node and drop it into the, I'm not sure if it's the top or bottom, we'll find out. And then put that straight into the displacement like that. Now, the way this is supposed to work is that this factor amount here is supposed to act as the bump mapping. Yep, that's correct. So it goes into the bottom input like so, and then set at 0, you get 0 bump mapping. Okay, but if I turn this up to be 0.1, you can see you get a little bit of bump mapping. So that's a really subtle amount there. I think I used an even subtler amount. Subtler, I don't know if that's a word. Amount for my render. I think I might have used like 0.05. You don't want to get over the top with the bump mapping, because then it just looks like you're being cocky. Like, hey, I'm using cycles and I know how to use bump mapping. Aren't I cool? So just make it relevant to the scene. Don't go overboard. If it's subtle, you're doing it right. So that's a general rule of thumb there. Anyway, so that's the bump mapping for you. It's a little unorthodox to probably what you're used to, but once you've done it once, I'm sure it'll stick, and you won't have any problems in the future. Okay, so now we've done the hardest material. Let's discuss some of the others. So one of them is the plates. So I'm going to apply a material to the plates in a similar fashion to what we started to do with the floor. I'm going to add a new material, and because I want a blend of both reflectivity but with the original color of the plate as well, I'm going to have to use Mix Shader. So again, setting the top one to glossy and the bottom one to diffused. You can do it the other way around if you want, that's fine. And I'm going to make the roughness of this 0.1, so it's quite sharp looking reflections. And I'm going to change let's set that to 0, see what that is. Okay, that's 100% reflection right there. Let's set this to 0.8. Now it's kind of hard to see the effects of it because we've got a window right behind it. But if you have a look along the edge of this plate here, you can kind of see the effects that it's having there. So if I turn that down a little bit, it's more reflective. You turn it up. Anyway, something around that is fine. Obviously, have a look at real photos of ceramics in real life and compare it to what you're getting in cycles. But that's the gist of the ceramic material. Now, in order to apply it to the other plates in the scene, you do it the same way you would normally in Blender. You just select the objects like this, one by one, holding down Shift and right-clicking, and then select the last object again that you just applied a material to, hit Control L, and then select Materials. And it will now, if it's done it correctly, I'll just check. Yep, it's now applied that same material to all the other plates for you. So, very, very simple, very cool. As I said, you use the same methods for most of the stuff in Blender. Not a lot has changed except for the materials. So there's it's still consistent with probably a lot of what you've learned. The next thing I'm going to add in is the glass bowl. Now, this is very cool. If you've been using Blender for long enough, you'll know that glass always looked ugly using the Blender internal render engine. It didn't seem to matter, what it was, however you tweaked it, however little enhancements you made, glass always looked shoddy. Very inaccurate and just poorly done. It was just the nature of the shader. It wasn't physically accurate, and it was just one of those things you just had to accept that you were never going to get realistic glass using the Blender internal engine. Cycles, on the other hand, watch how easy this is. Add a new material, set the shader to be glass. Finish. That's it. It now has an accurate glass material. It's like a preset. Just select it and it is good to go. Excuse me, just getting a drink there. Anyway, I'm sure you can, there might be even more options added in the future or something like that, but the default options work really well, and I don't really need to tweak those at all. As you can see, it is, it's accurate to the way glass behaves in the real world, the way it refracts around light and things like that. Really, really cool, and I'm just so glad that we can now have realistic looking glass in Blender, and more importantly, also you get caustics. If you don't know what caustics are, you might want to Google it, but it's essentially those little light patterns that you get on the ground when light shines through glass. Anyway, next material I'm going to show you is the spoon. Now this one is also very, very easy to create. All you do, add a new material, select glossy, and then for the roughness, just set that to be 0. And there we go. We now have a chrome, very chrome looking spoon right there. And that is essentially that. Okay, so I'm going to do that that icing that's in the bowl right there. I'm going to do that once we do the donut at the end. But that'll be fine. So let's go ahead and add in the rest of the scene, which is the donuts here. Now you'll notice that it hasn't added in straight away, but at the top there, it says building BVH. Now it's going to do this whenever you add in lots of objects that have lots of geometry. The reason is just that it needs to load it into cycles and it needs to go through a certain amount of processes in order to do that. Sometimes it's going to crash cycles and you're not going to get any output. That happens when you don't have enough RAM in your graphics card. It was something I had to battle as I was creating this scene. Okay, so what I'm going to do, let's just go to camera view mode so I can see what I'm clicking on. And I'm going to select this main donut here, the chocolate donut, and I'm going to show you the material that I applied for that. It's very simple. We're going to be using a mix shader, and you probably guessed it, it's going to be a glossy shader and a diffuse shader. Now, I think I used for my original one that I threw up on Facebook, threw up isn't the right term to use, like a blah, here you go, have it. I think I used 0.8, which is, 80% diffuse and then 20% glossy, but I think a lot of people were saying it looked quite metallic and a bit fake and plasticky, which I realize is now right. So changing it to 0.9 I think works a little bit better. So it's predominantly the diffuse color with a little bit of shininess applied to it. And also I think setting the roughness to be a 0.1 gives us nicer results as well. Now the color of the icing is entirely up to you. I'm going to go with chocolate. So I'm just going to select the diffuse color there, and I'm going to make this a brown color, like so. And there you go. Nice chocolate. I think, no, roughness is definitely wrong. I think it has to be 0.2. Yeah, the lower you set that roughness amount to, the more fresh the icing is going to look. So if you set that to 0, it's going to look like it just came out, dribbled, straight onto the donut whilst it's still warm and a photo was taken. But if you want more kind of hard set looking icing, you go for a value like 0.2. And I think that looks pretty good. I think, yeah. It's not bad. I'm not going to show you the rest of the icings because it's essentially the same. It's just using that exact same material, but instead of using this diffused chocolate material that we've applied here, you use blue, you use pink, you use whatever flavor you want, really. It's up to you. Now, for the donuts as well, the way this was done, I'll just show you if you just have a look at this one right here. You can see I've got a donut. Actually, there might be one in the background. Yeah, this one right here, you can kind of see it a bit better. This one I actually used a UV image that I created myself in Photoshop. Very, very easy. I'll just show you it now if I can. The blend is going rather slowly because it's always continuously rendering, which is cool, but also kind of gets annoying after a while. So I'm just going to go to the UV image editor just so I can show you what the donut is made up of, just for people that are wondering. Okay, it is UV donut. There we go. So it's that image right there. Really, really simple, like 2 colors that I just painted in there after UV unwrapping it, and that was the donut. Really, I mean, it's really subtle, and you can't really notice the the different color shades in the donut. Like you kind of can, but it's not that necessary. But really, really simple. That was just that was how it was done. So we're just coming to the end of the tutorial right now. I'm just going to quickly select the icing for this main donut right here, and I'm just going to make it the same icing for what is in this bowl. Okay, so I'm just going to go out a little bit. Let's select this one again. Control L, and then select materials. Okay, it hasn't done it for some reason. It did this before as well. Oh, actually, no, hang on, it has. Let me just adjust that. No, it has not. Okay, I'm just going to remove the material. I don't know why it's done this, but for just this material, I kind of have to select it myself. So I'm just going to very professionally do this whilst I'm recording, just to show you that sometimes things don't work for me either. And there we go. Now, that icing that's in the bowl there now shares the same material as the donut. One other thing I thought I'd just mention is that you'll notice that in the viewport, none of these colors that we've given things have been reflected in the 3D viewport. So the donut here is still white in color, even though we've given it a brown colored material. That's because it's now defined by the viewport color there. I don't know if that's going to be changed in the future or not. Doesn't really matter, but if you wanted to share the same color as whatever you've given the diffuse, just click that, click the color, then the eyedropper tool, and then just select the color that you've given it right there. Really, really simple, and it's up to you if you want to do that. Just makes things a little bit easier in the viewport if you've got different colors and stuff like that. And oh, one other final thing, I thought I'd just show you the depth of field. Now, depth of field is usually done in the compositor in Blender, but you can now do that directly inside Cycles, and it's physically accurate. Meaning you're not having to fake things and, you know, using the Z depth or whatever. It's all done accurately according to real world physical settings. So it's essentially, you select the camera, very similar to how it's normally done in Blender, and you select a focal point. So for mine, I've selected this, the empty, which is, oh, I should add in the sprinkles as well, just so you can see them. There we go. So I've selected this empty here to be my focal point, but you can also just make it any distance you want. And then the size that you give the aperture is going to be the amount of defocus that it gets. So I've set mine to be a 0.004. If you set it to 0, it means there's going to be zero depth of field at all. Now, the higher that you set this, the more out of focus it's going to become, or more shallow depth it's going to become. So when I first was using this, I thought, oh, I'll set this to, I don't know, a 0.5 or something. But watch what happens when you do that. Almost the entire scene instantly becomes out of focus, and you get this tiny point right there where you can actually see something. It's really, really touchy, really sensitive. So anything around about a 0.02 value should pretty well, it should do you well. I'm using a 0.04, mainly because it's a very small scene, you know, donuts. You can get away with a high depth of field, shallow depth of field than you would with larger scenes. Anyway, that's it, guys. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. I hope I have encouraged some of you guys to get out there and explore Cycles. It really is an awesome feature, and the sooner you start using it, the better, because that is the direction Blender is going in the future. Now, in approximately 1 or 2 months from now, in January or February of 2012, I'm going to have a Cycles competition where I'm going to just have an all-out who can create the best looking render with Cycles. So that is a competition for the future. So if you want to get practicing and get started, now is your time to do that. So thank you very much for watching, guys, and I will see you next time.